some of the oil companies are hedging their bets by creating divisions that are devoted to alternative energies, like BP and Shell have their solar divisions and are investing money in hydrogen research and so on. It's a relative pittance compared to the vast majority of their business, which is in standard oil.
For example, an oil company would be moved then because if there's no oil, I mean, how are you going to
Right. Well, for them, oil is still profitable. Remember, as the resource becomes scarce, the price goes up. So even though they're producing less oil, they're still making. Right now, the oil companies are making more money than they were last year or the year before. They're raking it in. Why? Because it's not any more expensive it's not much more expensive to actually extract the oil and transport it in tankers and deliver it to consumers than it was 2 or 3 years ago. But the price is over twice as high. So where's that profit margin going? It's going to oil companies, oil-producing nations, refiners, and so on. So it's still an extraordinary profitable business. Yeah. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about coal. I have an acquaintance, I haven't met him physically, only via the internet, who actually works as a contractor for the U.S. Department of Energy. He was just hired on in the last few months. And he was given the job. He doesn't actually work for the Department of Energy, but for a company that is contracted with the Department of Energy. He was given the job of doing a Hubbert curve analysis for U.S. coal production. And he came up with a surprising result. There's a lot of coal in the ground, and we're often told, well, there's 200 years worth of coal in the ground. Yes, there's a lot of coal in the ground, but it takes energy to get coal out of the ground, and much of that coal, it takes more energy to get it out of the ground than the coal will actually give us. Right? So once you start factoring that in, and also start factoring in the fact that yes, demand will be increasing over the next few years because we're running out of natural gas. We have to produce electricity. Where are we going to get the electricity from? Inevitably, it's going to be coal, mostly. There's going to be a push for new nuclear plants, but those are extremely expensive. It's going to take a while to get the permitting process. It's mostly going to be more coal. Okay, so if we factor in increased demand and the declining energy profit ratio from coal as we use up the better deposits, we end up with a U.S. peak in coal production likely to occur in only about 20 to 25 years. So it's not as though we'll be able to continue using coal for another 200 years. It's not going to happen, at least not in increasing amounts. Right, well, yes, if we're going to develop alternative energy resources, the time to do it is 30 years ago, actually. But certainly, if we wait until the market says, oh, by the way, oil has just peaked, and now it's going to be astronomically expensive. If we wait until then, it's insanity, because then we'll be having trouble supplying basic services to the people of the world, and it's going to be triage. Do we use the oil that we have this year to keep the bread trucks moving and keeping the grocery shelves stocked, or are we going to invest it in new energy resurreach? Plastics, right, and feedstock for chemicals. Some of those chemicals are very important and necessary too. Fertilizer, natural gas, yes. Right. As for population reduction, I don't know. I mean, there are theories being bandied about on the internet about designer viruses that are being worked on in military laboratories and so on. I know nothing about that. I'd prefer not to speculate about it. However, I think it's reasonable to assume that if Cheney, for example, understands that energy shortages are probable starting in the middle of this decade, that he's also planning for increasing levels of repression and social control. quite frankly, I believe that from this point on, we should assume that we're living in a dictatorship. I would expect, given what I know of people like Cheney and Karl Rove, that among the first things they will do after the inauguration is to begin systematically going after every leftist organization in the country using the IRS and every other means they have at their disposal. And so we are going to be in those of us who are advocating social change or who may be on the left end of the political spectrum are going to be fighting very defensive battles. We're going to have our hands full. That's all I can say.
So their whole business model really is based on cheap oil.
It is, and global oil peak is not going to be good for Walmart. But unfortunately, it also will not be good for all the millions of people who are dependent now on Walmart because the rest of their local economy has been destroyed and cannibalized.
World's biggest retailer.
Yeah. Oh, that's tough. Well, over the longer term, the whole marketplace is just going to be devastated. I mean, yes, it is possible to make synthetic oil out of coal, for example, but it's extremely costly, and the energy profit ratio is extremely low. So we're looking at, on the whole, much less economic activity. We're looking at economic contraction, and undoubtedly, poorer people will be hit hardest. The only upside is areas of the world where people have not yet become dependent on the industrial system. And those people may be in some ways better off than people living in American suburbs who are so overwhelmingly dependent on fossil fuels that they simply have no alternatives. Yeah, some of those subsidies are not under the control of the government. So we do give subsidies to oil companies, but that's not directly to lower the price of gasoline. Part of the subsidy is from the linking of the dollar, U.S. dollar, to global oil sales. Oil is traded globally for U.S. dollars and essentially for U.S. dollars only. This was a rule that was adopted by OPEC in the mid-1970s, first by Saudi Arabia, big pal of the U.S., and then later adopted by the rest of the oil exporting countries. And the consequence of that is that it's maintained the value of the dollar and enabled the U.S. to import oil much more cheaply than any other country. So the other reason that European oil or gasoline is more expensive to Europeans is that they tax gasoline much more than we do here in this country. Those things could change. I doubt if this administration is going to want to tax gasoline more, but much of that price differential between the U.S. and the rest of the world could disappear as the U.S. dollar collapses. And notice I say as it does rather than if it does. Well, I'll tell you. I used to belong to an academic organization called the International Society for the Comparative Study of Civilizations. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about human civilization and why human civilizations tend to crash. And just as a dispassionate scholar, forget the fact that I happen to be living in this civilization and totally dependent on it. If I just, sort of extract myself from the picture as a dispassionate scholar, I would say clearly we are living in the early collapse stage of the most vast and most extensive civilization the world has ever seen. Now, I talk about this in the last couple of chapters of PowerDown. What does collapse actually mean? It means reversion to a lower level of complexity, social complexity. And that can be sudden and dramatic and chaotic and violent, or maybe not. In many cases, historically, it has been. I don't think it needs to be. But if it's going to be a peaceful, cooperative transition, we're going to have to work very hard at it. It's possible. I believe we have the capability of doing that, but we're going to have to apply demand-side solutions in pretty dramatic ways. Yes, we do need supply-side solutions too. Yes, we do need to develop alternative energy sources, but if we don't do that in association with heavy demand-side changes, then we're not going to get there. Putin has said he's interested in doing so, but as far as I know, they haven't actually formally begun doing so. I wouldn't doubt that a lot of oil actually does change hands for euros, but not in a formal sense. Well, you've lived there. Maybe you have a better idea than I do. Some of these problems are not easily solved. And we love to have easy, quick solutions, but I'm afraid some of these problems may literally have no solutions, and some human problems don't. It's like getting old. There's some ways of getting old that are better, and some ways of getting old that are worse, but it's not a problem you can solve, right? And running out of oil is one of those problems. Oil depletion is not a problem we can solve. There are just better and worse responses to it. And the problem of people living in Phoenix is going to be one of those that I think is going to be really hard to solve, quite frankly. Well, we certainly 200 billion wouldn't have provided solar panels for everybody, but we probably could have done a couple of states. It's a good start. The whole process would cost. My back of the envelope calculation is $3 to $5 trillion to solarize the whole country, homes and businesses. So that's a fair chunk of change, but $200 billion is a fair chunk of change too. It would start to get us there. At present rates of energy usage, it would be an enormous task. When you just sit down with a sheet of paper and say, well, how many solar panels is it? How much space would we need? Oh, those could all fit in this corner of Texas. Those kinds of calculations are pretty easy to do, but when you start looking at not just the direct costs, but the indirect costs, it adds up really quickly. And frankly, I don't think that we are likely to supply the U.S. with this current rate of energy consumption with renewable energy sources. We are going to have to first reduce our rate of energy usage pretty dramatically, maybe by as much as 75 to 90%. And then what is absolutely necessary, we hopefully still can provide.